It's 9 o'clock. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We have a full agenda in front of us. And, I ask for a motion to approve the agenda. So all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the first item on our agenda is the shoreline management. Eric Olson is in the room with us, and I'm going to have Chris embarrass Eric for a few seconds, just giving him some background.
And good morning, Mayor, Council, those in attendance here with us in person and online via our Zoom platform. Welcome to the 2023 agenda. And as the mayor said, we have Eric Olson, who I've had the privilege to work with Eric for almost 20 years. And around the world of coastal engineering, I understand that Eric is renowned in the U.S. Along the U.S. coast. Yeah. But Eric's got a long history of working as the coastal engineer on for the village of Bald Head Island for many councils before this one. I think the consistency we've had with Eric throughout the years has definitely been of a benefit and of value to the village, to the extent that when we think about past work that's been done and achievements, terminal groin structure is one of only one in the state of North Carolina. Well, since Ocean Isle Beach has put in one, now two, but the first one that was put in from the law was passed by the General Assembly back in 2009, 10-ish, and how that's performed speaks to the work of Eric and his engineering. And so we invited Eric last year. Unfortunately, couldn't make it in person, but he's here with us today. As I know, there's a lot of questions about ongoing erosion towards the east end of South Beach, and there'll be some questions on that. And without stealing Eric's thunder, I'm going to let him take over and go through the presentation. And just want to add, this work schedule that we have before you is very aggressive. We've tried to build in time for some back and forth and Q&A. It is, in my opinion, a flexible work schedule. So I know with some, we could get up here and talk for an hour and a half. Others might be 20 minutes, but we're going to try to stick to this the best we can and work through it. So, all right, Eric.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here to see many of you face to face. Used to say it's not a pretty face, but there's a lot of it. This is my 25th anniversary. Not looking for a watch or anything, but it's been a long legacy. As a matter of fact, the first study we did for the development was back in 1989, which was 35 years ago, more or less, almost. But we had the pleasure of working with various councils and various managers. And there's, as Chris alluded to, there's a long legacy of projects here. I'm glad to see that Mayor Sarah was here, because if I got sick, I knew he could do the slide job. He's seen it all. Interesting enough, this is the west end of South Beach. Notice the tubes there. Not just too dissimilar from the east end of South Beach today. Of course, we have resolved the problems at that location pretty satisfactorily with the terminal groin and beach fills. I'm going to go over a number of issues, and towards the end of my talk, probably I'm going to put out to you something that has to do with decision making that you need to make a decision on with respect to the next major project to be constructed on South Beach. Now, I apologize in advance. There's a couple of typos in here that we had put this together a couple of weeks ago. I was in a administrative hearing that was a bit of a crunch, and so I put this together at that point in time. Just to give you a little background, the amount of sand that we lose off the island every year is somewhere between 300 and 400,000 cubic yards of sand. The second slide here says the ends are the most essential. Well, that's sort of a Freudian slip. It should say the most erosional. Obviously, on the west end of South Beach, the inlet is the nexus for the problem. On the east end, of course, it's Frying Pan Shoals. Of course, we have one of the three major headlands in the state, which is Cape Fear Headland. It's a very unique situation down there, and that we have going on what we would call large-scale geomorphological changes, which is basically the geology of the end of the island. That's what we're dealing with today. Of course, once upon a time, it looked like this, which is very hard to believe. Had a number of changes over the years. We lost a large-scale accretion. We've had substantial accretion in an area which I've never seen it, at least in the last 25 to 30 years, on East Beach. Of course, this is what it looks like today. We've got severe erosional stress, which endangers the Shoals Club. And we're ending up with a spit feature, which is completely anomalous, at least with respect to documented history of the point. So I thought I'd go over some of the benefits of your nourishment and disposal efforts that you put significant money into over the years. There's been long-term beach and sand dune growth, volume gain. At this point in time, there's 2.8 million cubic yards in the system on South, and mostly on South Beach, that didn't exist in 2002. It says 1982, but that should be 2002. That does not include the sand that's being placed out there right now, which is about 1 million cubic yards. So that's the amount of sand that has been added to the system, which has resulted in the robust beach and dune system that you have today. Didn't look like that in 2000, obviously. By virtue of that, you have obviously significant storm protection, environmental habitat for turtles, of course, the recreational amenity that it is itself. There was a point in time prior to the success of nourishment on the west end of South Beach that actually we had the roadway damaged. Infrastructure was endangered. Right now, of course, with the terminal groin, we have hundreds of feet of beach in that location. We have a robust dune system and pretty significant vegetation. This particular graph is meaningful to coastal engineers, but we use it for groups like yourself. It shows the long-term benefit of adding sand to the system. So what you're looking at here is, let's say, the first federal project, which was the deepening project back in 2000, 2001. It added this volume of sand to the system, 1.4 million cubic yards. Then over time, that sand leaves the system. We again monitored it. It was almost back to where it began in about 2005 or 6. This is where we rebuilt the terminal groin field. Also, there was a federal project at that location. So again, we're putting sand back in the system. It erodes away. Put sand back in the system. It erodes away. And of course, the infusion of sand are either federal projects from the navigation project, or there are projects constructed by yourselves. And so over time, we've significantly increased. And when you plot projects like this and we have an increasing slope, that means you have a successful project because you're getting ahead of the losses. You're putting sand into the system and you have a net increase. And as I mentioned, it's over 2 million yards today. So we're basically, we're at this point here in 2021 with the federal project, which put about 1.5 million yards. Right now, we're right here, and with the next monitoring report, we'll see again an infusion here of sand of probably over 1 million cubic yards. Interestingly enough, to some degree, we've sort of topped out here, which sort of also intimates that we're at the sweet spot, probably not going to see any significant growth beyond this point. So the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan, that was the genesis for today's beach management program, which again began more in 2000, not 1982. I'm not sure where this got in there. It evolved a schedule for sand placements by the federal government episodically. And it allowed the village to develop what we call a 3-legged approach. It was based on structures, federal disposal, and then local projects constructed by yourselves. Okay, and so that is the management device that we have today. Structures being the terminal groin and the sand tube groin field. This is a near-term schedule from 2015 into the future to 2027 that depicts the activities of the federal government. On the top up here, we have the federal government's efforts in putting sand on Bald Head Island, down here on Oak Island. Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan ended up with a formula, an ad hoc formula that was more, well, it was politically driven. It wasn't really technically driven. In the end, it basically said that for every 3 nourishment or disposal events, when we dig the channel and have 1 million yards or more of sand, 2 of those times we'll put it on Bald Head Island, 3rd time, put it on Oak Island. Again, that was a political decision at the time. So as you see here, when sand is typically placed on Oak Island, you build your own project and have 2 disposals on village on Bald Head Island. Again, in 2025, it's predicted that the sand, well, it's not predicted, it's scheduled that the sand will go to Oak Island. It's at that point in time that you have to make decisions of what you do again with respect to building your own projects. And again, in 2027, in theory, maybe 29, the sand would come back to Bald Head Island. Now, at this point in time, beginning in about 21, the recurring interval has been about 2 years. There have been times when the Corps was dredging on a 3-year basis. That became problematic, particularly for yourselves, because the rate of erosion was so significant that we had sort of setbacks. The Corps now is on a 2-year cycle. And it's, in my experience, that's always been budget determined. And that's why they had problems back when they did, that they couldn't get the budgets certain years. And so they let the channel go. At this point in time, we're assuming they're on a 2-year schedule. They maintain that that's their intent. And again, a lot of that has to do with legislative appropriations or where they get their maintenance money. So as I mentioned, frequency 2 out of 3 disposals go to you based on the plan that we have today, which theoretically could change when they do the harbor deepening project. We know that the formulation for that project in the feasibility study, it addressed the sand management plan and basically alluded to the fact that it could be modified in the future or certainly investigated. And it's something obviously that the village needs to keep track of, because at the very least, you want to maintain what you have. In the best of all worlds, you could better that. For example, we determined, well, the Corps determined based on a very cursory study that there was this 2-to-1 erosion rate, or basically the total transport rate, which is how much sand moves per year. When you compared Bald Head Island to Oak Island, and basically they came out to 2-to-1. Later on, when we had developed very sophisticated models for the village to do the term from the line field, we went back and revisited this. In our opinion, at that time, the ratio really was about 4.5-to-1 based on the total transport rates. We presented that to the district, but we didn't really get anywhere with it at the time. So if we look at the beach disposal scenario, at this point in time, when they're on a 2-year cycle, they're digging about 1 million. This year, I think it's going to be 1.2 million based on what Chris said, cubic yards of sand for disposal. They place it on South Beach, but they always place it on the west end of South Beach because that's basically the least cost for the federal government. To have them pump it all the way, to not put it on the west end and to pump it all the way, let's say down to the east end, would be a very large delta cost and time frame, and both of those are of interest to the Corps of Engineers. The sand quality varies. The sand that comes out of the inner segments is the best quality sand closest to Oak Island. And as we move out and we go up offshore where the dredge is today, the sand is much finer. So the sand that is placed varies in quality. Quality affects its performance, and basically performance is longevity, how much it stays, how much dry beach do you get, and how much dry beach do you maintain over time? How does it last? Again, at least historically, we've been at the mercy to some degree of the federal budget. We're not at this point, particularly with all the infrastructure money. The Corps districts have more money than they know what to do with. So this is what the disposal obviously looks like. You've probably seen this either in the monitoring reports or in the information that Chris puts on the web. This is the project as it's ongoing. And again, it's in the Corps' best advantage to put as much sand on the west end and to make it as big as possible because they get the best cost from their dredging contractor. So the sand placement here is pretty robust. And there's pluses and minuses of that. Get into that in a second. So when the Corps has about 1 million or 1.2 million cubic yards of sand to place, they only get about 60% of the way down South Beach from west to east. That's well documented. That's by all the monitoring studies. And again, what they're looking for is the least cost project. This is not a beach nourishment project to the Corps. It's a beach disposal project. So it's just a sidebar of channel maintenance. Okay. And so they do not have any incentive to maximize its benefits as you would prefer. Now in 2001, yeah, that's true. They did get down to the west end. The material, unfortunately, that was placed down there, which fell just shy of the Shoals Club, again, was the very fine sand. So if you've been a student of the beach at all, you'll see that sand disappeared very, very rapidly, which was unfortunate. So it moved basically into frying pan. Shoals probably is part of the genesis for the type of sediment spit that we're seeing there today also. Now, next probable actions, and this is to some degree guidance that I need to seek from the council either today or in the very near future. So you have the option of putting sand basically just on the west end of South Beach, which is pretty much mandatory because it's time to rebuild the sand tube groins. And as you'll see in a second, the only way that we can do that is to do it in the dry. So what we do is we fill that beach, we bury the groins, we go in and we dig the groins out and replace all or portions of them. Historically, for I think the first two, well, their initial construction and their first reestablishment, we replaced the sand tubes in their entirety. And these sand tubes are 300 feet long, length of a football field. In the last nourishment or the last maintenance of the tubes, we came up with a different scenario because we historically, due to the monitoring, we know that the tubes, unless you have a dramatic storm effect where the Corps does not place material, not all of the tube is ever exposed. It's usually only the distal end. And of course, the distal end is the end of the surface zone that wears out just due to the gradation of the sand and sand movements, propeller scars, you name it. So what we did is we basically replaced only about half of the tubes. We went in, dug out half, cut the tubes off, and put in about, on average, maybe 150 to 200 feet of tube. And in the future, we probably would do that again. One of the obvious advantages of that is that the tubes that were put in originally now have dune on them. And when we did the first replacement, which was the entire tubes, we literally had to dig into the dune to get to the end of the tubes. And so that was kind of a stupid thing to do. And so we decided that we didn't need to do that in the future to impact the dune because we'd have to revegetate it. We can put it back, which we did, but there's an effort of revegetating and sand fencing and remediation.
Is there any negative effect that you see by not doing the other 150% of the tubes?
No, not at this point in time. As long as we have a status quo of the sand being placed in the groin field, either by the village or by the Corps, you know, it's rare that you see a quarter of the tubes ever exposed. Matter of fact, they're well buried right now by this contractor, Marinix. So under that type of a scenario, our advice again is to go in and to do partial replacements. Because you dig them up and 90% of the tube is perfect. It's just the end that is worn out. And unfortunately, we don't have any methodology for just replacing the end of the tube. We've tried to improve the quality of the tubes over time, which we have, the type of coatings that we put on them, the type of material that they're made out of. And we've gained some longevity that way. But again, we're dealing with something that needs to be replaced probably on a 5 to 7 year scenario. Now, again, with the sand being placed pretty frequently, even though some of these tubes have deflated at their ends at the end of their project life, there's been no real downside of that. If we were to stop sand placement, there would be. The tubes themselves would become very activated, and eventually we would get erosion through the tube, through the groin field back to some of the conditions that we had years ago, where we had water under a couple homes, we had water getting to the road, lost the dune field, et cetera, et cetera. But under today's conditions, it's the replacement scenario would be still similar to what we've done in the past. So that basically, in my opinion, that has to be done. You have, your next project is at the minimum has got to be putting sand on the west end of South Beach, replacing the groins. You're dealing with 500,000 cubic yards of sand, more or less, and then the replacement operations, which is a second contractor to replace the tube fields. The other decision, however, is whether or not you want to do something on the east end of West Beach or South Beach, excuse me, in the vicinity of the Shoals Club. And so there's sort of a must do, and then there's an alternative for you to consider that eventually, and we need guidance on, because if we're going to do something like that, we need to initiate or to modify existing permits that we have. So the sand tube groin field is very important. It actually works in concert with the terminal groin. It covers a part of the island there to the east of the terminal groin, where we have the curvature in the shoreline. You'll notice that that's where the groin field is. If we took the groin field out, we would have recession of that shoreline because of that curvature, because of the accentuated energy. Again, replacement historically has been about 5 years. I think a little further this time. The Corps of Engineers supports that groin field because they believe that it helps reduce the amount of sand that gets into the channel. So they have embraced it, which is a good thing. And again, as I mentioned before, it protects roadway infrastructure, et cetera, not to mention single-family residence homes. So again, as I pointed out, the only way we can replace these is to do it in the dry. We've got to build a beach fill. The sand for that would come out of Jaybird Soil's borrow site. In the process of modifying that borrow site by extending it to the north. So it necessitates a dredging project. And as I mentioned, the groin field itself is bid as a separate project. Most of the dredging contractors don't want anything to do with structures that they don't have to do. And again, the permits require feasible or modification. So again, this is what it looks like. That is the sand tube in the upland. You can see that it's been excavated here. I don't know if this is going in or coming out. I can't really tell you at this point in time. But again, that's the nature of the tube. It's about 6 to 8 feet high at its landward end. Tapers down a little bit on the seaward end. And it's basically a big tube of sand, which is it's compact as concrete, except that it's vulnerable to vandalism and to wearing out, and that if you rip it or cut it, the sand, of course, can weep out of the.
Eric, I think that's going in because the portholes covers are exposed and not capped.
Kind of looks that way, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't place it, you can't fill it at one end because the slurry doesn't get down. So we have to fill it like on 25 to 50 foot intervals. Yeah, and we learn that over time, how to do that best. And also how to come up with some better plates to seal the thing off. Originally, they just tied these things off with ropes. And it was not very satisfactory once they were exposed. So the second action is the companion beach fill on the east end of South Beach. Now, the ideal sand source for that is frying pan shoals. The frying pan shoals, and we've been for several years trying to permit a large scale borrow site there for future beaches. And the size of the project that we permitted or of course submitted in the permits was about 2.5 million cubic yards, pretty large volume of sand. Now, the reason we did that is because that allowed you in the future, if you had a major hurricane, to have a borrow site that you could go to and provide very quickly remedial actions on all of South Beach. Put the beach back, put the dunes back, protect your interests without having a permitted barge site. Be delayed a year or two probably in the process. Now, the sediment quality there is much better than Jaybird Shoals. It has a lot of shell ash in it. It's a very coarse material. As you know, it's a very high energy area. You look out there, it looks like a washing machine. Well, the more energy that's on that shoal, the coarser the material exists on that shoal, because that's how it sustains itself. So it is the ideal borrow site, and that's why we went after it about 2 or 3 years ago for long-term beach restoration activities. Now, what we've run into is a headstorm, well, a pretty large hurdle that has to do with fisheries issues, not based on science, but based on concerns. We have 2 fisheries groups. We have a state fisheries group, and we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that controls what the Corps does. The Corps has no objection to it. And I'm not sure that the normal CAMO would either, but the fisheries people, who are a resource group, are adamant that it not be used. Personally, I don't believe that it's a fisheries issue. I think it's a precedent issue. They don't want these shoal features to be tapped. You have several of them in the state of North Carolina. There's like over 1 billion cubic yards of sand in this feature. It goes offshore 30-something miles. It's inexhaustible. It's renewable. The sand that comes off South Beach in an easterly direction, and what comes down East Beach in the southerly direction, it all goes in frying pan shoals. It grows, okay? Which means that any borrow site that we build out there would fill in very rapidly. There would be no fisheries issues. And in our experience, actually, to some degree, there are fisheries benefits. But the fisheries people talk about migrations and uniqueness and shark habitat, you name it. But again, the big picture is probably precedent. They don't want these things tapped. They're afraid of opening Pandora's box, is what it basically this comes down to. At this point in time, our permit is still active. We haven't withdrawn it. It's 2.5 million cubic yards. My intent in the next couple of weeks is to get with our environmental consultant who's here in Wilmington and put another option on the table, which is to reduce the volume of dredging from 2.5 million cubic yards down to about 500,000 cubic yards. The 500,000 cubic yards would be used only on the Shoals Club if we elect to put sand on the Shoals Club. And it would provide a better probability of success in trying to put a large quantity of sand on the east end of South Beach. So we would look at something like this. Again, on the left, we have the groin field. We fill this section, we put the groins back. There's no real reason to do any work in the middle of the island because it's relatively stable. What we learned a number of years ago, well, we actually learned it in 1989, which was then borne out by more sophisticated modeling today and by monitoring, is there's a nodal point in the island. And the nodal point is the point in the island where sand moves to the west and sand moves to the east. And by virtue of having this nodal point, the reason it's there is because there's a low spot in the energy or balance of the energy, so to speak. And so by virtue of that, the beach here remains fairly robust. And so there's really no reason to be out there nourishing it. So the option A is doing just this. Option B is adding in some level of beach fill on the east end. And it wouldn't be a trivial. It would probably be about 500,000 cubic yards. And be transparent with you, it's a strategic gamble because what we're trying to do is change the dynamic in that area. So it would not necessarily always function as a normal beach fill functions. In theory, what we would like to do is provide enough material. Put enough material in here to some degree flood the marginal channels there that breaks through all the time. Now, if you look at the monitoring reports, you'll see that actually this spit over in certain years has tried to come back to some degree. But what happens is we have a major storm and it just basically blows through here. And so my theory is that if we're going to do this without structures, and if I had a structure, I could provide pretty good assurances that I could change the dynamic there. But structures are not allowed. Can't put we have a terminal going here. You can ask Charles. We'll ask Charles his opinion on any type of structure. If I was in Florida, I would build a structure there and I could resolve this problem through beach fill and through a structure, through the accretion of the structure. But in the state of North Carolina, we can't do that. The only structures you're allowed are those tubes that you see out there to protect your interest, which is a very short-term type of armoring.
Just for clarity, you're going to say tubes, we're talking sandbags, not going to tubes.
Bags, yes, yeah, not tubes.
So the sandbags don't last kind of long unless there's the rock terminal groin to support it first.
Yeah, they're subject to damage during storm events because you know, the water hits them on a daily basis. So you can imagine what hits them on a storm basis when you have some surge and real wave energy. So they're subject to movement, they're subject to damage, and you have a maintenance issue just putting them back just to protect your interest. So this is my recommendation at this point, which is again either alternative A or alternative B, which is 2 segments of each. Failing changing the mind of the fisheries interest to even allow a 500,000 cubic yard borrow site. We can get enough material out of Jaybird Shoals to do it. But I'll tell you that the material that comes out of Jaybird Shoals is nowhere as coarse as the material that comes out of Frying Pan Shoals. So by virtue of that, it lowers the probability of success. And again, there may be additional costs associated with doing that because we have to pump it all the way down from the west end of South Beach to the east end of South Beach. So those are the parameters that you have to understand to go with this particular scenario whereby we build a fill down there, 500,000 cubic yards, but we use Jaybird Shoal material. So with that, as Charles says, I always come with bad news. At least it's news, I guess. So those are the options that are going to be before you either today or in the very near future with respect to the level of expenditure that you want to do. You want to incorporate into your next beach nourishment event in 2025 or more or less in that time frame.
So if we couldn't get Frying Pan Shoals, you would still recommend doing something at the Shoals Club with the Jaybird Shoals, or?
It's a value determination by the council. I mean, there's nothing else I can do.
Right.
Put it that way. I can't put a structure in. I can't change the dynamic. I have no probability of changing the dynamic down there through any other means. The only other long-term prospect would be potentially when the Corps deepens the channel again, that there's enough material to get all the way down to South Beach or get all the way down to the Shoals Club. They did that with the first evening back in 2000. We actually put sand all the way down where the Shoals Club was. So they nourished the entirety of South Beach. We had to leverage them a little bit. Mayor and council did at the time because they actually underestimated the amount of sand that was coming out of the channel. And they got to a point where about $1.25 million, $1.5 million had been put on Bald Head, and they realized they need to put some on Oak Island. And they were about to pick up sticks and do that, but the council basically leveraged them into completing the job on South Beach. So it has been nourished once, but the big problem is the change in the morphology that's going on here, and how to get around that. So it's with either borrow site, it's a calculated project. I mean, it's a risk project, but there is no guarantee of success.
What's the definition of guarantee of success? How long are you saying the land would have to last for it to be successful versus a waste of money?
Well, again, it's a value judgment. I mean, it's 3 years worth of protection, 5 years, 7 years, 2 years.
That's what I'm looking for. You don't have a crystal ball. But if it's been done once, or if we take 500,000 out of frying pan trolls, what is your estimate of how long that would last versus it be gone back to the state before we started?
Well, without frying pan shoals, I think you've got maybe a 70 to 80% chance of success.
For
For
1 year, 2 year, 3 years?
multiple years.
Multiple years,
multiple
okay.
years. It's very coarse material. And what we would build down there is a very wide beach, okay? It wouldn't be a normal beach. It would be an extraordinarily wide beach, so it's sacrificial. Can do the same with frying pan shoals, but that material will erode away much quicker. Or excuse me, out of paper shoals, but that material will move from that configuration much quicker.
Which is why the one in 2000 didn't work as well as what you predicted. If we got it from frying pan shells would work better.
Yeah, the major genesis for change down here is just the spit issue. The sand that was placed down there, it did last a fair amount of time, but the erosion rate on the east end has always been pretty voracious, particularly since this configuration disappeared.
And one more stupid question. I know the groins don't work great without the terminal groin being there first. But if we did two groins, one, is it even possible? And two, would that create the success years moving from 2 to 4 or 3 to 5? Or is it even possible?
Yeah, that would increase the success. As Charles will tell you, to get the sand tube groins that are on the other side of the beach, that took a piece of legislation. That was not a normal permitted activity. You are the only one in the state, and it was done by legislation.
I'd heard that for the terminal group jetty, but you're saying it's also for the tubes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Well, the terminal groin was a generic legislation that said, okay, we're gonna build 5 of them, we're gonna allow 5 of them in the state. You were the first to do it.
Eric, I think to clarify the soft-filled groin tubes, the village got a variance approved by the Coastal Resources Commission in 95 to put
Then it
those-
was codified.
Oh, was caught, okay.
Called Ed.
It was legislated, wasn't it? Yeah, in some form anyway.
Yes.
So it was special dispensation. I know not whether you could do that again. I defer to Charles on that. Kind of doubt it. Now, if it was allowable, yeah, I'd say that was a reasonable solution, even a short-term solution to try to change the dynamic by impounding sand. That's what you're trying to do with the structure.
Eric, how much do we typically take out for our village projects? You know, how much sand do we typically move for a village project?
The last one, which again was only on the west end of South Beach, was globally, I think, 1 million yards.
Okay, and we need, when we do a village project, we need at least 500 of that just to cover the grind field.
Yes, yeah, my estimate, yeah, because it's in relatively good shape because of these federal disposals.
So theoretically, a normal village project would be taking out enough sand to address both those issues and leave the nodal area, the middle area
Correct,
alone. And it's extra expensive getting a fan to the far end of the island.
correct. Yep, yeah, it's an option. It's a,
And the cost of that 1 million cubic yards just to stay down on the west side, roughly, is that $15 million every 3 years? What is that, Zach?
it could be 15 million dollars, yeah.
And if we were to do, well, let's say, well, just incrementally, the 500,000 out of frying pan shoals to this end, what's the estimate for that?
Probably 7, 8.
7 or 8.
Yeah.
And Zach, What are we accruing for on target to be done, 2025?
25, October 25 is the last payment on the current feature nourishment loan.
Okay, so you'll accrue cash first, borrow it, and then pay it off.
And
I have to look a little closer at the timing and the numbers because, for example, between the first private project and this current one, we did have a brief period where we paid interest only as we hadn't quite finished paying off the first project. But we've managed to work through that.
But you've set the scope close enough for government work right now. Well, I should say government work for government. We say that in corporate world all the time. 15 million is the West End. Your recommendation is 7 million if we did the 500,000 on East End.
I'm saying that's probably what it's worth out of that project, yeah.
Okay, thank you. For a couple of years.
Yeah, plus you know, don't forget you've got the cost of the sand tube groin replacement. That contract is additive to any sand fill placement.
Do you see a possibility of the morphology changing back? The point swinging to the south?
Not in the near term. I've gotten optimistic a couple times over the last decade when I saw accretion actually coming back. Some storm event would take it out. I'm not sure what it would take to bring it back today. Almost to take some storm event in Oslo Bay to actually push a lot of that material back into the corner on the other side. Because right now the energies are pushing it to the east.
Mhm.
But yeah, there were a couple occasions, a couple of years where the monitoring shows that, wow, you know, this is starting to change here, but didn't last.
So the only option not on here is, and I'm certainly not suggesting this, you know, to do one side, do both sides, to do nothing. What is the option? What occurs with that?
The do nothing option exposes the groins, material in the sand tube groin field would erode back.
I'm sorry, I meant on the east end, not on the west
the east
end.
end.
That, yes, I'm sorry, on the east end.
Well, it's status quo. We don't see material moving in and seaward of, we survey it twice a year. So I don't see much of a solution other than what you have today, the status quo, which could get worse.
I think that's what I'm asking, how much worse? Would it get worse and how much worse? As a guess, I know you don't know for sure.
Well, the area just updrift or to the west of the Shoals Club start receding further back into the dew line,
And the club itself?
would become more seaward. It'll probably become what happens is they become a headland as the beach recedes around it. You become a headland.
Chris, I've got a finance question for you, Zach. So our current payoff on beach renourishments has been based on the original every, 3 year, now it's a village, like every 9 years, right? Or what was
More like 2 to 4 to 5 years. And it stretched to 6.
Okay.
When the Corps didn't have funding. I think there's,
Okay, so good. So I was afraid that we were paying off over an 8 or 9 year period. Well, you're telling me that we pay it off in 5 or 6 years.
yes,
And we're ready to go for the next one. All right, so we're good with that.
so far we've managed to work it out that way.
Yeah.
With adjustments to the tax rate, the MSD zone rates and so forth,
accommodation.
and our accommodation tax.
Thank you.
Okay,
Go ahead, man.
I just have one more. So, when was it that we were discussing this? When we were coming back from,
Oh, we were coming back from the byways meeting,
yeah. so
North Carolina byways.
we were evaluating whether it was worthwhile to spend that money and during this core dredging and pay extra to have them pipe it all the way up. And at that point, what was coming into play was how fine the sand was, and the extra expense of pumping it all up with, you're just doing something that was going to disappear almost immediately. Is there a change the quality of sand from,
15 months ago or so.
yeah. Whereas federal projects change, does sand actually change, or is it, that would always be the case?
It'll pretty much be the case. The Smith Island Range gets material that comes off of the ebb tidal shoal. That material, for some reason, is much coarser than what comes out of. Segment 1 is generally not too bad because it comes off your beach. Segment 2 is fine, because the further out on an ebb tidal platform you go, the only thing that gets out there is the finer sediments that are blown out there. And so that scenario with respect to what comes out of the channel for maintenance probably won't change. It may change when they go to expand it, because they'll be digging horizontally into some of these shoals. As they deepen, they have to widen also. So some of that material could be better. There's also a lot of material they have to avoid, because when you get down below about 24 feet, you get into clay.
So early on in the dredging and putting up sand is your best sand. The early sand, the first sand they put up is the best. What happens as we go?
That always ends up in
digging?
the field.
Yeah.
Ideally, you'd like it at the other end of the island, or you'd like
Right,
it to go, yeah.
got it.
Yeah, that's,
So it gets-
it's just a fact of life, because that is the best way for the contractor to work.
So the Army Corps of Engineers have said, no, they're doing it right now. 2 to 3 years from now, it's our turn.
Right.
Other risks involved, could we get a no from any applications we have to put in from CAMA? Can anyone, we choose one of the options on your sheet here? And does someone have the authority to say no and shut it down if we're gonna pay for it?
I think the probability that's very low. I think your ability to do your maintenance is a given. Including putting sand all the way down to the east end from Jaybird Shoals. That would be unique, but I don't think it would be denied, or there would be any heartburn.
So the fisheries could only maybe
Fishery,
stop putting
they keep-
sand from.
Yeah, they keep driving us back to Jaybird Shoals, and we're going.
Yeah.
It's a finite resource, guys. It doesn't recover overnight. It takes decades to begin to recover, and sometimes the material that is in there is not necessarily the best material that you want.
They don't have application approval authority. They could just complain.
Well, they're part of the regulatory process.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, they're stopping us on frying pan shoals.
Okay.
They're objecting in the process, both the federal and state process.
Okay.
And right now that permit is, it's just in limbo. That application is in limbo.
And you think that objection is might be based on quantity? I'm looking at something else, but yeah.
You taking 1 million, that's gonna really hurt us. If you only take 500, it's not gonna hurt us as bad. I'm trying to think of.
I'm hoping that flies. I don't know. Okay, you guys won, here's the deal. We asked for 2 and, you give us a half.
Right.
You've won. Sometimes that works in the process, sometimes it doesn't.
But does that negotiation discussion occur with them ahead of time before we start throwing applications back and forth to see what they would accept?
Well, we've had the application in for 3 years, and we've proposed addressing the fishery issues in advance by studying it, because they don't have there's no knowledge there. And the village has agreed to do the studies to allow them to make an informed decision. There's no interest in it. We just don't want you out there. Basically what it boils down to.
But the probability of getting frying pan shoal permit as a borrow site, if we talk about in theory, they're setting a precedence.
Yes, even with 500,000 yards.
That's why I'm saying that even the
Right.
500,000, based on the answers I just got, it's not 2 million versus a 500,000.
And the other-
It's a no.
Then the other part of this, while all this is going on, we still have to go through a geo bond process if we're gonna to fund it. And we gotta go to the LGC for approval. And we gotta get the financing in place to fund the project. And I gotta check my notes from the last one we did, if we have to have permits in hand to secure all that. So there's a lot of other work involved, and it's all to say that, if we make that decision, that's the decision that's made, and that's how we pursue it. We had discussed a to process of, trying to go for both. Right, trying to continue with the Jaybird Shoal application and restart the Frying Pan Shoal. But then there was some talk about, well, we don't want to confuse the regulators or the resource agencies and but ideally, we were hoping to have that Frying Pan Shoal borrow site permitted to do the last project, but we're getting all the pushback on the fisheries. And at a point, we said, we got to go back to Jaybird Shoals, because if we didn't, we would not have, right, we would not have had the permits to do that project.
The permitting for Jaybird Shoals. So our application is in already,
Not for Jaybird Shoals now.
not for Jaybird.
No,
So we're studying now to get that permit.
no, we know it's studied. We just haven't submitted it. And we need to decide what the context is. We submit that and leave the other out there. Or do I submit that and I modify the other? See what floats. Failing there, then you take Frying Pan Shoals out of the equation. Go just with Jaybird Shoals.
Was that your point where to keep our options open, we applied for Jaybird Shoals to go all the way out to the end of West Beach? Simultaneously, we applied for the 500,000 Jaybird Shoals and then amended backwards.
Yeah. Basically, yeah. And the 500,000 cubic yards can be floated with staff in advance, consultation. You have regulatory consultations. Basically say, okay, you guys have won, but we got to have this, because otherwise we're not going to resolve this problem down here. Is this really what you want to see? You want to see sand tubes on the beach? That's what you've got. Unless you give us the option of trying to have a successful beach fill down there. Most times these people are, they're pretty headstrong. They have, they're narrow. Their vision is pretty narrow. And if the issue is just precedent, then, we've told them that the project that we're permitting right now is a one-time project. We've backed off and made crystal clear. This is a one-time deal. It'll recover. You won't see it in 5 years. It'll be gone. But that's still, it's the issue of us tapping it and probably other people tapping it in other locations. Although the feds are looking at tapping it beyond the 3-mile limit. But you don't want that sand out there. I can tell you, it's fine. So it's not a panacea. Plus you'd have to, the cost would be probably 50% greater, because you'd be using hopper dredges instead of pipeline dredges to access that material. But the feds have gone into, BOEM has gone into studying, has just funded a major study of sand sources beyond in the federal waters for future use in federal projects. Or Oak Island. I know Oak Island has an interest in it. But that's probably at least a 5-year study.
One last question for me. Eric, the harbor widening project. You talked about the nodal point on the island right now, based on current conditions. If that project and when that project goes through, I don't think it's a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
Do you see that nodal point moving?
No, I don't. I don't think that's going to change.
Okay. Thank you.
Or just to point, the Corps just got funded to do the analysis of the Section 203 report for the State Ports Authority at a cost of about $8 million, and it's going to take till about 2026 just to get through that. So any notion of getting the sand from a deepening project is going to be well beyond that. Maybe 2030.
Yeah, it'll be a phased project because it's huge.
Right.
Huge.
Is there anything else we need to be thinking about this far ahead of that project? And of its potential impact and potential additional mitigation strategy?
Yeah, Chris and I were talking about that coming over on the ferry. I think it'd be wise to make sure that the Corps has copies of all the concerns you have submitted to the Port Authority that have gone unanswered. And with the rhetorical question of, are you going to answer these and how and when, and can we be helpful to you?
Yeah, and a lot of the questions we had, core Wilmington district staff had as well, so that was.
Yeah, they did have some concerns.
I know, Eric, we'd also talked about East Beach and it being a part of the shoreline monitoring program. And we included that back starting in 2008.
Yeah, so it's been monitored. This will be the 15th year, I think. And it shows that it's, it's relatively stable. It's cut back in some storms, recovers nicely. The dunes recover. There've been a couple of times, I think, when the village has assisted the recovery by pushing sand up after some of the events. But, the continuation of management just through that type of a management and, again, COs and sand fencing if necessary, seems to fill the bill.
So, Peter, I think you were going to be in Raleigh in, let's say, February, visiting, Representative Miller and Senator Raven.
Right.
Filling them in on the lack of response by the Ports Authority might be helpful to share with them in some form or fashion.
Right.
And we're looking for answers, we're not getting them. Can you help us? Think about it. I'm not saying we have to do
No,
that,
I know,
we need to do
I know.
that, but it would seem to me that, they would want to help.
Yeah, well, I think that's a byproduct of the funding that the State Ports Authority threw into the Section 203, which was a new study that was afforded by the federal government. And so with the understanding that they knew at some point beyond that, they were going to have to do a full-blown EIS NEPA process.
Right.
And at that time, then they would be putting all the money into doing and following through. We just need to, like we said, make sure the Corps has all that again during that process.
Yeah, okay, we're good. Thank you.
I have one last thing, it'll kind of cue up the next group coming up here, but when we're talking about the fisheries and we have a lobby group, and they're gonna be up there, is there individuals, is there, if we're gonna focus on trying to change their mind or change the, argument of the discussion, are there key figures that they should be approaching? And what kind of background do we need to give them before they ever approach anybody?
Yeah, it's at the staff level, both in the state and then probably down in St. Petersburg for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're a pretty tough group to influence historically.
Yeah, I mean,
They're not real sensitive to political pressure.
I don't want to take away from what Steve or Monica might suggest, but a congressional inquiry from the delegation, from the senators and our local representative.
Doesn't hurt.
Yeah, because I feel like we did that before for a previous project we were working on with, it may have been the terminal groin project, trying to work that through the federal permitting process. I seem to recall.
Yeah, well, they put a lot of hurdles in front of us, but in the end, due to your funding of a very sophisticated numerical model, we were able to answer all the questions. I mean, we had questions such as, what happens to fish larvae when you build your groin? That's what the fisheries people put out there.
Right.
We said, no problem. Give me 3 days, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I can model it.
Eric, thank you so much.
Thanks so
You
much.
are a very valuable component to this island, and we greatly appreciate all the work you put in over the years and.
Well, you've been-
appreciate the work with it.
You've been one of my favorite groups to work with because you're pragmatic, you understand, and you're solution oriented.
Thank you.
Not every group is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.